Hiking many miles over multiple days with a loaded backpack is demanding on our feet. It's no surprise that footwear is one of the most important pieces of gear for hikers. Anyone who's ever dealt with foot issues on a backpacking trip knows this all too well. In this video, I'll share what I've learned and go over what has worked well for me when it comes to footwear for hiking. I'll also share some foot care tips at the end. Now, before we get into the video, I just want to say that footwear is very personal, so what works well for me may not necessarily work for you. But I'll go over the reasons for my choices so you can decide if these apply to you. I hope this information helps in deciding what the right hiking footwear choice is for you. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the video. First, I like to think about a few goals to keep in mind with any hiking footwear. There are a lot of choices when it comes to hiking footwear, and I need my footwear to minimize foot pain and fatigue that comes from all the mileage on a multi-day backpacking trip. I also need my footwear to keep my feet as dry as possible to minimize the chance of blisters, maceration, or other skin problems. And I also need my footwear to maintain traction, especially on steep or loose terrain, as this affects my safety. My first footwear consideration is fit. When choosing footwear for summer, I'll try on my shoes with my summer hiking socks. When trying on shoes, I look for a shoe that doesn't constrict any part of my foot, doesn't chafe or rub anywhere, and my heel should not slip when walking. I like to have a little bit of space between my toes and the end of my shoe. The extra space is needed since my feet will swell a little bit during hiking. Also, I need the extra space to make sure that my toes don't hit the front part of my shoe on descents, which would be very uncomfortable. When choosing footwear for winter, I'll try on shoes with my winter hiking socks. My winter footwear will be a size or two larger than my summer footwear. And this extra space is needed since my winter socks are thicker than my summer socks. In winter, I usually use a liner sock and a mid-weight sock. Again, I'll look for the same fit requirements that I mentioned previously. All right, next, breathability. During the 3 seasons, and especially in summer, my feet get hot while hiking. I need a shoe that can easily vent the heat out of my footwear. A shoe with a breathable mesh upper will keep my feet drier. Wet feet create conditions that can lead to blisters or other foot problems, so my preference, especially during summer hiking, is to always look for footwear that utilizes a breathable mesh upper. All right, next, weight. I prefer lighter weight footwear. There is a saying that 1 pound on your feet equals 5 pounds on your back. Whether or not that's true, it certainly will take more energy to move heavier footwear as opposed to lighter footwear. Also, lighter footwear allows me to be more nimble with each step. Now, my footwear still has to be appropriate for the terrain that I'm traveling on and the weight that I'm carrying, and I'll get into more of this later in the video. Footwear will get wet at some point on a multi-day trip. It can get wet from hiking in the rain, hiking on a trail in the morning that has overgrown brush, crossing a stream, or crossing a long snowfield. When they get wet, I want a shoe that can dry quickly. Footwear made with mesh will help expel water from the shoe. Also, shoes made with lighter synthetic fabrics will dry faster than those made from heavier materials such as leather. A leather boot that gets wet can take a long time to dry, especially in cooler temperatures. All right, stack height and cushioning. Let me define stack height since I'll be referring to it several times going forward. Stack height is measured as the distance from the ground to the bottom of your foot. So if you add up the thickness of the outsole, the midsole, and the insole, you get a shoe's stack height. And the midsole itself accounts for most of the stack height. So it's really what determines whether a shoe will have a low, mid, or high stack height. A shoe with a higher stack height will have more cushioning than a shoe with a low stack height. And over the years, I've tried shoes with minimal cushioning up to shoes with maximum cushioning. And after all that experimentation, I've settled on a preference for a shoe with a medium stack height. And here's the rationale behind arriving at this preference. hiking involves covering many miles over steep and uneven terrain. Shoes with a higher stack height mean our feet are much higher with respect to the ground, and that higher center of gravity makes the foot less stable on uneven terrain. And if the terrain is on an angle, your body weight moves from the sole to the upper, which can cause you to lose traction or even roll an ankle. A high stack height shoe is fine for those times when the trail is fairly smooth and flat, but not good on steep and uneven terrain. And this is why I'll stay away from a shoe that has maximum cushioning. I find a medium stack height shoe is a good compromise between cushioning your feet over many miles to minimize pain and fatigue, while still maintaining some stability on steep and uneven terrain. All right, flexibility versus stiffness. I prefer a shoe that has a flexible sole versus a really stiff sole. A flexible shoe is going to be more comfortable when hiking long distances. A flexible shoe will also better distribute the impact force with each step compared to a really stiff sole. Now, a stiff sole is going to be better if I'm going to be traveling on steep snow or I need to kick steps or edge. So if my trip includes a lot of this, I may need to consider footwear with a stiffer sole. Now, durability is a trade-off that you make with trail running shoes. Something like a trail runner will be more comfortable than a hiking boot, but it will come at the expense of durability. For many hikers, this is an acceptable trade-off. Hiking with heavier pack loads with steep terrain, including off-trail travel that includes rugged ground such as scree, talus, granite, or brush, is going to place more stress on footwear, and a trail running shoe will wear out much faster than footwear that's better equipped for that terrain. For example, the mesh upper on a trail running shoe can easily get torn up when hiking across a scree field. As hikers, we travel across a variety of terrain. The terrain can include dry hardpack trails, muddy trails, loose rock or soil, steep terrain, and so on. Unfortunately, there isn't one outsole design that excels in all conditions. I have a couple of examples here that are designed for different terrain. The outsole on the top has shorter lugs that are anywhere between 2 to 4 millimeters deep. The lugs are spaced much closer together. This outsole design is better for hardpack trails. Now, the outsole on the bottom has deeper lugs that are anywhere between 5 to 7 millimeters deep. These lugs are spaced further apart to help shed mud. This outsole design is better for loose terrain such as mud or snow. Also, the deeper lugs and wider spacing means that it won't be as comfortable on hardpack trails compared to the other outsole design. Now, if we take a look at the direction of the lug chevrons, we can see that these have both climbing lugs and braking lugs, which help on steep terrain. The direction of the chevrons on the rear help with braking on steep descents, while the chevrons at the front of the shoe help with climbing up a steep trail. In my case, I spend most of my hiking on harder pack trails, so I prefer an outsole like the one on the top, as this design matches most of the terrain that I travel across. Think about your body weight plus the weight of your backpack and imagine stepping on a sharp rock. That ends up being a lot of load applied over a small surface area, and that impact can bruise the bottom of your feet if your footwear doesn't have protection to deal with this. Many trail running shoes these days include a rock plate. The rock plate will help to distribute that impact force over a wider surface area to protect the foot. So I look for a trail running shoe that has a rock plate to protect the bottom of my feet from sharp rocks. Walk enough in the backcountry and you'll eventually inadvertently kick a rock or a root. Anyone who has done this knows that it can be painful. To mitigate this, I like footwear that has a toe bumper to protect my toes from the impact. Here are a couple of examples of trail running shoes with good toe protection. There is a lot of hiking footwear on the market that includes a waterproof breathable membrane such as Gore-Tex. For 3-season hiking, I don't use footwear with one of these membranes. Personally, I only consider using footwear with a waterproof breathable membrane for winter. During most of the 3 seasons, my feet are warm in my shoe, and I like footwear that doesn't have one of these membranes that would inhibit breathability. Also, footwear with a waterproof breathable membrane will take longer to dry due to the membrane restricting airflow through the shoe. Now in winter, I'm more concerned with keeping my feet warm, so the membrane can actually slow the transfer of heat from inside my boot to the outside, which will keep my feet warmer. Here's my current lightweight hiking boot that does utilize a Gore-Tex membrane. I use this boot along with an overshoe when snowshoeing, and this setup works well to keep my feet warm and dry in winter. It's important to match your footwear to the use case. So when I think about which footwear to bring on a given trip, I look at the following factors. First, season. My footwear for summer will be very different from my footwear for winter. In summer, I'm usually going to bring a shoe with a breathable mesh, whereas in winter, I'll bring a boot with Gore-Tex. Second, terrain. Is my trip completely on trail, or does it include off-trail travel? What type of terrain is the off-trail travel? Is it rugged terrain such as crossing boulder fields, scree, or talus? And what is the percentage of that off-trail travel? As I mentioned before, if my trip has a lot of really rugged terrain, I may consider footwear such as an approach shoe that uses more robust materials that's better equipped to deal with that type of terrain compared to a trail running shoe. And third, what is my planned daily mileage? If I'm hiking on a trail doing a lot of daily miles, then a trail running shoe is going to be preferred as it's going to be the most comfortable. Fourth, pack weight. Is my pack on the lighter end or is it on the heavier end? If my pack is on the lighter end, then I'll choose a trail running shoe. If my pack is on the heavier end, then I may need to consider a more robust shoe that can better support the load. Now, I'm only going to bring one set of shoes on a given trip, and obviously that pair of shoes is not going to excel in every one of these conditions. So whatever I end up going with, it's ultimately going to involve a trade-off. So for example, let's say I have a trip where it has a lot of daily mileage and 85% of the trip is on trail, 15% is off trail, and that 15% still has some rugged areas. Now, in a case like that, I'm going to prefer comfort for all those daily miles that I'm going to be doing. So I'll go with a trail running shoe. But boy, the 50% of the time when I'm off trail, I would much prefer a different shoe, like say an approach shoe that's better equipped for that type of terrain. But as I mentioned, I can't bring multiple shoes. I'm only going to bring one. So the shoe that I ultimately go with will have some trade-off. So you just have to decide, what things you're willing to trade off and what's the best choice for you. All right, I wanted to share some foot care tips that I've learned over the years. The first deals with hot spots. As you're hiking, the moment you feel a hot spot, it's really important that you stop immediately and address it. If you don't, you're going to regret it. It's going to cause you problems. You'll end up with a blister, and you don't want to have that. That'll really ruin a trip. So the moment you feel that hot spot, pull your shoe off, pull your sock off, inspect your foot, tape it up, deal with it. Don't just continue on. The second, be sure to keep your feet and your socks clean of any debris. You don't want any debris in your socks that's going to abrade your skin. So that's an easy one that you can do, and just don't ignore that. If you've watched my clothing video, you know that I carry an extra pair of socks, and I rotate those each day, and that way I start out the day with a clean pair of socks. The third one, and this is one of the most important, and this is something that I've learned from thru hikers. When you get to a break in the day, lunch or maybe some other breaks where you've got some time, take your shoes off and your socks. Let them dry out. If they're in the sun, they'll dry out pretty quickly. And it's really important for your feet to dry out. when they're in your shoe and you're hiking all day, they're gonna be wet. So take time, dry them out. It'll avoid problems down the road with your feet. The next one is keep your toenails clipped and filed. You don't want any sharp edges on your toenails. And then the last is, and it seems like an obvious one, but be sure to break in your shoes before a trip. You don't want to go into a trip with brand new shoes that you've not worn, even if they're a model that you've had used in the past and has not given you problems. Take the time, break them in. Trail running shoes obviously aren't going to take as long to break in as compared to, say, boots. All right, so that concludes the video on hiking footwear. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more related content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.